A Nazi officer disappeared in France and was found charred inside a burning vehicle. Decades later, another Waffen-SS commander died trapped when his own house burned to the ground. 2 different lives, 2 identical endings, fire and destruction. Both had belonged to the elite of the Third Reich, both built power amid the violence, and both ended up consumed by the same flames that accompanied their crimes. There was no redemption, only a destiny marked by the brutality of the war. How did a decorated officer become a prisoner executed by firing squad? What connects these 2 endings separated by more than 30 years? And what do their deaths reveal about the inevitable cost of war? The dark ascent from apprentice typographer to Waffen-SS officer Helmut Kämpfer was born on the 31st of July of 1909 in the city of Jena, located in Thuringia within the then German Empire. His father worked as a printer, a respected trade in German society at the beginning of the 20th century. The family belonged to the artisanal middle class, with traditional values of work and discipline that marked the education of the young Helmut. During his childhood, Germany was going through the years following the First World War. The defeat of 1918 had left deep wounds in German society. The Treaty of Versailles imposed severe military restrictions, limiting the army to 100,000 men and prohibiting military aviation and tanks. War reparations generated an economic crisis that worsened with the hyperinflation of 1923 and later with the Great Depression. Kämpfer initially followed the family tradition, training as an apprentice typographer. Typography represented a sector with tradition in Germany, where the publishing industry and graphic arts had considerable development. His training provided him with technical discipline and methodological order, characteristics that would later prove useful in the military field. The German economic situation of the late 1920s and early 1930s changed the professional prospects of many young people. Massive unemployment and political instability created an atmosphere of uncertainty. For men like Kämpfer, a military career was seen as an alternative for job stability and social advancement. In 1933, coinciding with Adolf Hitler's rise to power, Kämpfer joined the Wehrmacht. The National Socialist regime had begun to expand the armed forces, gradually evading the restrictions imposed by Versailles. The Reichswehr, the official name of the German army since 1919, would be transformed 2 years later into the Wehrmacht with the introduction of compulsory military service. The moment of Kämpfer's entry coincided with the reorganization and modernization of the German army. The new regime prioritized the training of military cadres committed to National Socialist values. For young people from middle-class families, the officer career represented a path of social and economic promotion in a Germany that would rearm. Kämpfer demonstrated skills for command and military organization. His superiors valued his discipline, leadership ability, and tactical understanding. These qualities allowed him to advance in the military hierarchy during the early years of his service. The German political evolution between 1933 and 1939 completely transformed the country's military landscape. Heinrich Himmler developed the Schutzstaffel, initially a personal protection organization for Hitler, transforming it into a large-scale paramilitary and later military structure. The Waffen-SS was established as the military arm of the SS, seeking to recruit the best elements of German youth. Kämpfer made the transfer from the Wehrmacht to the Waffen-SS during this period of expansion. The SS offered possibilities of rapid promotion, better equipment, and a special status within the German military apparatus. For ambitious officers, it represented an opportunity to become part of a military elite. His incorporation into the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich placed him within one of the most prestigious formations of the Waffen-SS. This division had initially been formed as a regiment in 1934, later expanding to reach divisional level. It was equipped with modern material and received priority in the supply of weaponry and vehicles. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, began. Kämpfer participated from the start in this campaign as commander of the 3rd Battalion of the 4th Panzer Grenadier Regiment of the Das Reich Division. His unit operated as a reconnaissance element, carrying out exploration missions, securing routes, and making contact with enemy forces. The Eastern Front presented completely different characteristics from the previous Wehrmacht campaigns. The distances were enormous, the climate extreme, and the Soviet resistance much greater than initially anticipated by the German command. The battles acquired a particular intensity and brutality, conditioned both by the Nazi racial ideology and by the nature of the conflict. During the autumn and winter of 1941, the Das Reich Division participated in the offensive towards Moscow. The temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero, and the German advance was halted at the gates of the Soviet capital. Kempfer managed to maintain his battalion's operability in extremely difficult conditions, demonstrating leadership ability in adverse situations. Kempfer's actions on the Eastern Front earned him recognition from his superiors. He received the Iron Cross Second Class for his performance during the autumn battles. Subsequently, his merits in the operations of 1942 earned him the Iron Cross First Class, a distinction that confirmed his reputation as a competent officer. Throughout 1942 and 1943, the Das Reich Division continued to operate in different sectors of the Eastern Front. The German forces were facing both regular units of the Red Army and partisan groups operating in the rear. This irregular war required specific methods and posed complex tactical problems. During the winter of 1943 to 1944, the Red Army launched the Zhytomyr-Berdychev offensive. This operation aimed to defeat the German 4th Panzer Army and reclaim strategic territory in Ukraine. The Das Reich Division found itself engaged in intense defensive battles against numerically superior Soviet forces. In the framework of this offensive, Kempfer directed operations of his reconnaissance battalion that were regarded as exemplary by the divisional command. His unit managed to maintain cohesion and combat effectiveness despite adverse conditions. These actions earned him the award of the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, one of the highest military decorations of the Third Reich. The Knight's Cross placed Kempfer within the group of the most outstanding officers of the Waffen-SS. The Nazi regime used his figure for military propaganda, presenting him as a model of the young, competent officer committed to National Socialist values. He appeared in specialized publications and was cited in speeches as an example for new generations of leaders. At the beginning of 1944, the German strategic situation on the Eastern Front had deteriorated considerably. The defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk had severely weakened the offensive capability of the Wehrmacht. Soviet pressure forced the withdrawal of numerous divisions and the reorganization of defensive lines. In this context, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich received orders to move from the Eastern Front to France during the spring of 1944. The German command anticipated an Allied invasion in Western Europe and concentrated its best units to face this threat. The division was initially sent to Montauban in the south of France, where it had to complete its reorganization and re-equipment. Kempfer, with the rank of Sturmbannführer, retained command of his reconnaissance battalion. His unit had light armored vehicles, motorcycles, and mechanized elements that provided it with high mobility for specific missions. The move to France represented a significant change compared to the Eastern Front. Although the war was not yet being fought intensively there, the activity of the French resistance constituted a permanent factor of insecurity. The German forces had received clear directives on the treatment of the resistance movements. France in flames. The resistance defies the Reich. The 6th of June 1944 decisively changed the military situation in France. The Allied landing in Normandy immediately activated the resistance in the interior, especially in the central and southern regions. In the department of Haute-Vienne, with Limoges as the main city, clandestine activity intensified visibly. During the years of occupation, the French resistance had built organizational structures that brought together diverse ideological trends. Among them were the communist-oriented Francs-Tireurs et Partisans, the Gaullist groups linked to Free France, and other nationalist and socialist currents. Despite political differences, there was coordination in operations aimed at harassing the occupying forces. After the news of the opening of beachheads in Normandy, unity of action became a priority. The British broadcasters transmitted encrypted messages that activated dormant networks across the country. From that moment, attacks on rail lines, roads, and communication networks multiplied, with the aim of preventing the transfer of reinforcements to the Norman front. In Limoges, the city's working-class tradition and the social fabric associated with porcelain, metallurgy, and textile factories provided fertile ground for clandestine support. The Maquis of the Limousin consisted mainly of young people who had rejected the service du travail obligatoire. This system, created by the Vichy regime in cooperation with Germany, forced French workers to serve in German territory. Many chose to take refuge in the forests and mountains of the Massif Central, where the rugged geography offered suitable conditions for clandestine living. The composition of the Maquis was heterogeneous. Alongside local peasants lived workers, students, and urban professionals. The peasants contributed knowledge of the terrain, the workers' technical skills, the students' connection abilities, and the professionals' organizational competencies. The leadership often fell to former French army officers or experienced militants who applied principles of irregular warfare. In the region, the figure of Georges Guingouin gained prominence. A former teacher turned guerrilla leader, he organized communist detachments with discipline and military structure. His tactics were adapted to the terrain and available means. Ambushes on secondary roads, blowing up bridges, attacks on small garrisons, and sabotage of communication facilities became common practices. The operational logic was clear: inflict as much damage as possible while avoiding prolonged engagements with superior forces. The weaponry came from various sources. Allied airdrops provided automatic weapons, explosives, and radio equipment. Depots abandoned in 1940 were still useful for obtaining rifles and ammunition. Furthermore, ambushes against convoys allowed for the capture of modern weaponry. The diversity of the material led to irregular equipment, but sufficient to maintain operational effectiveness. The civilian population played a decisive role in sustaining the resistance. The peasants provided food and information about German movements. In the cities, the liaisons transmitted messages, prepared false documents, and facilitated temporary shelters. This collaboration, although widespread, was associated with a high level of risk. The German forces and the French milice practiced systematic reprisals that included executions of hostages, deportations, and destruction of villages suspected of collaborating with the Maquis. The German occupation troops applied methods in France already used on the Eastern Front. The fight against the guerrilla combined tracking, encirclement, and annihilation of resistance nuclei. The Wehrmacht, together with the Gestapo, the French police, and the Waffen-SS, organized joint operations with the intention of destroying the underground network. In this context, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich received specific orders. Its commander, Heinz Lammerding, arranged exemplary measures for any manifestation of partisan activity, including collective reprisals. The German doctrine of occupation contemplated the application of collective punishments. In theory, the ratio was of 10 civilians executed for each German soldier killed, although in practice it was often exceeded. This policy aimed to dissuade rural communities from supporting the Maquis. The transfer of repressive techniques from the Soviet Union to Western France reflected the continuity of a strategy based on intimidation. In this context, on the 9th of June 1944, Helmut Kempfer was on a reconnaissance mission in the area of Saint-Léonard-de-Noblat. His reconnaissance battalion, stationed in Limoges, secured communication routes between the south of France and the sectors near Normandy. The roads of the region offered favorable conditions for ambush: dense forests, sharp curves, and uneven terrain. The Francs-Tireurs et Partisans, under the direction of Jean Canu, received information from local observers about the German movements. The civilian surveillance system allowed for quick and accurate transmission of data. On a particularly favorable stretch, Kempfer traveled in a light vehicle with little protection, relying on mobility as the main defense. The intensification of partisan activity after D-Day had substantially changed the security conditions in the region. The ambush was carried out quickly. The attack surprised the vehicle and avoided any possibility of reaction. Kempfer was captured without the nearby German forces having immediate knowledge of the fact. For the resistance, the detention of a high-ranking Waffen-SS officer constituted an achievement of enormous value. His capture had a double effect. It represented a propagandistic success and, at the same time, generated a tactical challenge for the Maquis, who had to decide in a short time the fate of their prisoner. Fire as a sentence, the execution that unleashed the massacre. The afternoon of the 9th of June 1944 developed in a climate of continuous movements and growing tension in the Central Massif. The Maquis who had captured Helmut Kempfer knew that his disappearance would trigger an immediate reaction from the Das Reich division. It was foreseeable that search patrols would begin operations at nightfall, advancing along roads, inspecting villages, and methodically tracking the area where the officer had last been seen. In anticipation of this, Jean Canu, responsible for the group that had executed the ambush, arranged for the immediate transfer of the prisoner to safer shelters, using hidden paths known only to the local population. The rugged terrain, with its dense forests and ravines, offered multiple hiding places that had been previously explored by the resistance for emergency situations. The clandestine communication system, supported by civilian links, allowed the news of the capture to circulate quickly among different cells of the movement. The arrest of a Sturmbannführer of the Waffen-SS was an event of enormous significance that required coordination in decision-making. Messengers on foot or bicycle traveled through villages and side roads, transmitting the information until it reached the regional commands. The communist leaders of the Limousin were alerted immediately to evaluate the available options. During the first hours of captivity, Kempfer was interrogated by local leaders of the Francs Tireurs et Partisans. The objective was to obtain concrete data about the disposition of the German troops in the sector, the planned movements of the Das Reich division, and the measures taken following the Allied landing in Normandy. The officer limited himself to stating his name, rank, and military identification number, strictly complying with international provisions on prisoners of war. His attitude was described as firm and disciplined, without yielding to the psychological pressures of the interrogators. The night of the 9th to the 10th of June was marked by intense discussions among the resistance leaders. Some leaders suggested the possibility of keeping the prisoner as a bargaining chip in future negotiations with the occupying forces. However, this alternative required risky contacts, prolonged custody, and the mobilization of resources that the organization could not guarantee. The experience in clandestine operations indicated that keeping a high-ranking officer posed a constant danger. The German troops would double their patrols and apply severe reprisals against the civilian population. Georges Gangouin, regional leader of the communist Maquis, advocated for immediate execution. He argued that the elimination of a Waffen-SS officer would bolster the morale of the resistance and have considerable propaganda value. Furthermore, he emphasized that freeing up human and logistical resources was essential to maintaining the mobility of the groups at a time when German pressure was increasing after the landing in Normandy. Finally, the decision was adopted collectively. The prisoner had to be executed. In the early hours of June 10th, Kempfer was taken to Broilaufer, where the resistance fighters had prepared the execution site. There was a German military ambulance abandoned in previous combats. The vehicle, still operational, had been repurposed by the Maquis as transport. The choice of the ambulance was not accidental. On the Eastern Front, similar vehicles had been used to transport civilian victims to extermination sites. Using it to eliminate a German officer had, for the resistance fighters, a symbolic value that reversed the roles between oppressors and executed. The subsequent accounts differ in certain details, especially in the number of prisoners locked up with Kempfer, which according to sources ranged between 3 and 6. However, they agree on the procedure. The fighters put the prisoners into the ambulance and blocked the doors from the outside, securing them to prevent any escape. The windows were covered and reinforced. Then the vehicle was sprayed with fuel, probably gasoline captured from German depots. The fire was simultaneously ignited in several spots. The flames spread quickly and the smoke invaded the compartment. The prisoners banged on doors and windows attempting to escape, but the exterior blockages prevented it. The civilian witnesses who saw the scene heard screams during the first few minutes of the fire, which continued until the smoke and heat stifled all movement inside. The combustion lasted about half an hour. Finally, the vehicle was reduced to a charred shell. The charred bodies remained inside as a visible testimony of the execution. The Maquis had called upon residents of nearby villages to witness the act, thus reinforcing the public dimension of the operation. The message was clear. The resistance could reach any German officer and apply justice in their own territory. The German patrols located the burned ambulance on the morning of the 10th of June. Kempfer's identification was carried out through personal items that had partially withstood the fire, such as his military watch and fragments of his uniform. The confirmation of the find was immediately transmitted to the Das Reich Division Command. Adolf Diekmann, commander of the 1st Battalion of the Der Führer Regiment, received the news shortly after. His personal bond with Kempfer, forged over years of campaigning on the Eastern Front, accentuated his reaction. He considered the method of execution as an act of barbarism and requested authorization from his superiors to apply a reprisal of great magnitude. General Heinz Lammerding, commander of the division, communicated the approval. The German High Command had established guidelines that allowed collective punishment of communities linked to the resistance. The death of a decorated officer justified, in the German logic, a punitive operation that was meant to serve as a warning to the entire population. The choice of target fell on Oradour-sur-Glane, a locality of 642 inhabitants located about 20 kilometers from Limoges. The village lacked military importance, but its destruction would send an exemplary message. The selection responded to criteria of accessibility, propagandistic visibility, and indirect linkage with the activity of the Maquis in the region. The operation began in the afternoon of the 10th of June. Columns of armored vehicles and trucks with troops from the Regiment der Führer surrounded the village, blocking all accesses with checkpoints. The maneuver was executed with the precision learned in encirclement operations on the Eastern Front. Once the closure was completed, the soldiers penetrated into the interior of the town and gathered the inhabitants in the market square. The population was registered and stripped of documents and belongings. Subsequently, the men were separated from the women and children. Nearly 200 men were led to barns and stone warehouses located on the outskirts, while more than 400 women and children were locked in the village church. The execution was carried out simultaneously. In the barns, the men were gunned down with sustained fire and the survivors were finished off. Then the buildings were set on fire with the bodies inside. In the church, incendiary charges were placed, which, when activated, spread smoke and flames inside. The victims tried to escape but were cut down by machine guns positioned outside. In this scenario, only one adult woman, Marguerite Roufanche, managed to survive. She succeeded in jumping through a side altar window, sustaining injuries from gunshots, but she was able to crawl to a garden where she remained hidden. She was the only adult witness of what happened in the church. After the executions, the soldiers systematically looted the homes, seizing valuables and food. They then set all the buildings on fire. The fire consumed homes, workshops, public buildings, and businesses. The operation lasted for approximately 4 hours. By the end, the town had been reduced to smoldering ruins and 642 people had been killed, including 7 Jewish refugees who had hidden in the village. The massacre of Oradour-sur-Glane surpassed the usual scale of reprisals in France. The operation, conceived as exemplary punishment, became a symbol of the extent of German violence against the civilian population. The ruins of the village remained as a testimony to a method of occupation based on intimidation and total destruction, a message that transcended the French territory itself and foreshadowed new tensions in the German strategy after the Allied landing. The Reich's protégé, the unrelenting rise of Joachim Peiper. Joachim Peiper was born on the 30th of January of 1915 in Berlin-Wilmersdorf, within a family marked by the German military tradition. His father, Woldemar Peiper, had served as an officer in the Imperial Army during the First World War and directly experienced the defeat of 1918. After the armistice, he joined the Freikorps, paramilitary organizations that proliferated in the Weimar Republic and kept the nationalist spirit alive in a context of political unrest. The Peiper home was imbued with militarism, discipline, and resentment towards the restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. In family conversations, the ideas of Prussian honor, discipline, and the need to restore Germany's lost greatness were repeated. Joachim grew up in this environment with his brothers, Horst and Hans, surrounded by tales of national humiliation and the hope of a revival of military might. The economic crisis of the 20s accentuated that climate. Like many middle-class families, the Peipers suffered from the deterioration caused by the hyperinflation of 1923 and later by the Great Depression. These experiences fueled their hostility towards the democratic Weimar system and reinforced their identification with speeches that promised order and national recovery. Joachim's education followed the patterns of the conservative German bourgeoisie. He received academic training with an emphasis on history, nationalist literature, and military values. From a young age, he showed sharp intelligence, ambition, and an ease in exercising leadership among his peers. His natural inclination towards youth organizations of a nationalist nature reinforced the ideological orientation he was already receiving in the family environment. On the 30th of January of 1933, the day he turned 18, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor. This coincidence deeply influenced his vision of the future. A few months later, he joined the Schutzstaffel, which was experiencing rapid expansion under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler. For young men like Piper, the SS offered a path for social and military advancement within the new National Socialist Germany. In October of that same year, he formalized his entry with the membership number 52,734. The SS had ceased to be a mere personal guard of Hitler and were transforming into an organization with state ambitions, conceived by Himmler as the future racial elite of the Reich. Piper fit into that model due to his physical characteristics, his discipline, and his ideological adherence. The training took place at the SS Junkerschulen, academies created to prepare the officers. There, they received military instruction along with intensive indoctrination in racial theories, geopolitics, and the historical mission of Germany. Reports from their instructors highlighted their analytical and leadership abilities, as well as their quick assimilation of the National Socialist principles. However, they also warned of traits of excessive ambition and a tendency towards egocentrism. In April of 1935, Piper completed his basic training and was appointed Himmler's personal adjutant. This position placed him in the inner circle of the Reichsführer SS and granted him access to the internal power mechanisms of the regime. He accompanied Himmler on trips, meetings, and official visits, closely observing the implementation of repressive policies and the functioning of the SS bureaucratic apparatus. The relationship between Himmler and Piper soon went beyond the administrative. Himmler saw in him a prototype of the new elite, young, physically in line with the Nordic ideal and completely committed to the ideology. That closeness generated a trust relationship that provided the young officer access to sensitive information and high-level decisions. In March of 1938, Piper joined the National Socialist Party, consolidating his political integration into the regime. In June of that year, he was officially confirmed as Himmler's personal aide, a position that made him a direct witness to decisive meetings and familiarized him with the methods of control applied in the territories under Nazi rule. The invasion of Poland in September of 1939 marked his first experience of war. He accompanied Himmler on his special train during the first weeks of the campaign and directly observed the occupation policy. In Bydgoszcz, he witnessed public executions of local Polish leaders, part of the strategy to eliminate the national elite to facilitate Germanization. Piper recorded these events with a technical approach, without showing ethical objections which reflected both his training and his ambition for advancement. In December of that same year, he accompanied Himmler to Owinska, near Poznan, where he witnessed a demonstration of the Action T4 program. There, he observed the experimental application of gas as a method for the elimination of the mentally ill and disabled. The procedure consisted of locking the victims in airtight chambers and releasing the gas, while observers followed the process through a window. The execution lasted between 10 and 15 minutes. Subsequent interrogations carried out by the Allies revealed that Piper described this experience coldly, analyzing the effectiveness of the method without moral considerations. In May of 1940, during the campaign in France, Piper obtained his first direct combat experience as a platoon commander in the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. He participated in operations against French and British forces and was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class. The swift victory also allowed many officers to enrich themselves through looting, a common and tolerated practice. Piper appropriated a French automobile that he sent to Germany, an example of the prevailing permissiveness. After the French campaign, he returned to his duties alongside Himmler. During that period, he had access to the plans for the future invasion of the Soviet Union. In preparatory conferences of February of 1941, he listened to Himmler's presentations on the colonization of the East, which included figures on the elimination or displacement of millions of individuals. Piper was able to see firsthand how these massive extermination operations were structured, in which the SS, the Wehrmacht, the civil administration, and private companies were to collaborate. In July of 1941, he left his duties as an adjunct and joined the 1st SS Panzer Division with the rank of lieutenant. He received command of a tank company, and participated in the initial offensive of Operation Barbarossa, advancing through Ukraine to the Dnieper. From the beginning, the orders received authorized the shooting of Soviet political commissars and the brutal treatment of prisoners of war. Piper's unit faced both regular forces and partisan groups. Anti-partisan operations replicated methods already applied in Poland, destruction of villages suspected of collaborating with the resistance and collective executions of civilians. These procedures were considered an integral part of the occupation strategy in the East. The experience in the Soviet Union consolidated Piper's reputation as an effective and loyal officer, willing to carry out orders without question. His rise in the Waffen-SS hierarchy continued, driven both by his command qualities and by the personal trust Himmler had in him. The protégé of the Reichsführer had gone from being a young academy cadet to a combat commander on the most brutal front of the war. The combination of ideological training, proximity to power, and battlefield experience projected him towards positions of greater responsibility in the SS military apparatus. From now on, his career would be marked by operations in which brutality was combined with military efficiency, reflecting the model that Himmler sought to consolidate in his closest officers. A borrowed life, the uncomfortable exile of a war criminal. On the 22nd of December of 1956, the doors of Landsberg prison opened for Joachim Piper. He had spent 11 years in captivity, convicted of war crimes after the Malmedy massacre. His release was part of a clemency policy promoted by the American authorities, influenced by the Cold War and by the need to consolidate West Germany as an ally against the Soviet Union. In this context, former Waffen-SS officers benefited from a strategy that prioritized political integration over punitive justice. Piper left prison having become a recognized figure within the circles of SS veterans. His sentence and his behavior during the years of incarceration had transformed him into a symbol for those who interpreted the post-war trials as acts of revenge. That notoriety, however, constituted a double-edged sword. It provided him support in certain circles, but made him a controversial figure in German public life. The Federal Republic of Germany was then experiencing a period of accelerated growth known as the economic miracle. The industry demanded labor and administrative staff capable of managing the expansion. Many former military personnel found reintegration opportunities within this framework. However, the memory of the conflict remained alive, especially among workers organized in unions who maintained a critical stance towards the presence of former Nazis in significant companies. Piper's first job was at Porsche in the international sales area. His language skills and his organizational experience provided him with useful credentials for the position. Ferdinand Porsche, founder of the company, had maintained ties with the Nazi regime and saw no issue in offering opportunities to former officers. But Piper's hiring generated immediate rejection. Union representatives considered it unacceptable for someone convicted of war crimes to assume responsibilities in a prestigious company. The protest intensified when the media recalled his role in Malmedy and in other SS operations. The unions promoted partial strikes and protest stoppages, while the press published articles with testimonies from survivors and photographs of victims. The management of Porsche attempted to reduce exposure by transferring Piper to a position with less direct contact with the workforce. However, the measure was interpreted as a covert promotion and provoked new demonstrations. The boycott by American veterans against the brand's cars worsened the situation. Faced with the threat of losing international markets, the company dispensed with Piper's services at the beginning of 1957. Shortly afterward, he obtained employment at Volkswagen thanks to his contacts in the sector. The company, which had emerged as a project of the Nazi regime, maintained a more flexible policy towards employees with a military past. Initially, his hiring went unnoticed, but the unions soon echoed the protests experienced at Porsche. They demanded his resignation and organized pressure campaigns that once again attracted the attention of the press. Organizations of Nazi victims reinforced the claim, pointing out that the integration of war criminals into the German labor market constituted an affront to the memory of the victims. The difficulties worsened when, in 1968, German prosecutors opened an investigation into the Boves massacre in Italy, which occurred in September of 1943. Italian survivors identified Piper as responsible for the execution of two local mediators, priest Giuseppe Bernardi and businessman Antonio Vassallo. Military documents confirmed the presence of his unit in the area. Despite the testimonies, the court concluded that there was not enough evidence to attribute direct criminal responsibility to him. The case was filed away, but the investigation reignited controversy and kept public scrutiny on his figure. The newspapers took advantage of that process to review his entire history: his closeness with Himmler, his participation in campaigns in the East and in Italy, and the crimes attributed to his units. For Piper, every attempt to reintegrate into German society was overshadowed by the persistent memory of his past. In 1970, he decided to leave Germany. With his wife Sigurd, he moved to France, settling in the town of Trave in the department of Haute-Saône. He had previously acquired a rural property where he hoped to find tranquility. The choice was paradoxical, considering that France had been the scene of crimes perpetrated by his division, but life in rural areas offered discretion. The French authorities were aware of his identity, but did not impose legal restrictions on his residence. Travis was a community of about 400 inhabitants dedicated to agriculture and livestock farming. The arrival of the Pipers did not go unnoticed, although initially it was tolerated with indifference. Joachim introduced himself as a retired German seeking peace in the countryside, avoiding references to his military background. His main occupation consisted of translating military books, which provided him with regular income and maintained his intellectual connection with military topics. Everyday life in Traves unfolded with a certain normality during the first years. Piper maintained correspondence with former comrades of the Waffen-SS and occasionally received discreet visits. His wife, on the other hand, integrated more into the local social life, participating in community activities. The coexistence seemed stable, although marked by the couple's reserve. In the mid-70s, that calm was broken. European anti-fascist groups began investigating the location of former Nazis who had taken refuge in different countries. In June of 1976, they distributed pamphlets in Traves denouncing the presence of Joachim Piper. The leaflets included period photographs and summaries of his crimes, with special emphasis on Malmedy and operations on the Eastern Front. The public complaint transformed the attitude of the neighbors. The community, which had maintained a distant tolerance, began to show open hostility. Graffiti appeared on the walls of their property and at the entrances to the locality. Insults and threats were combined with Nazi symbols used derogatorily. The French press picked up the news and amplified it nationwide. Journalists went to Traves to interview the locals and Piper himself. The reports recalled his crimes and reopened the debate about the presence of war criminals in French territory. The media coverage even reached the international press, which highlighted the paradox of a former Waffen-SS officer living in relative tranquility in a country that had suffered under Nazi occupation. Piper responded by giving interviews to certain media outlets. He intended to control the narrative and present his life in France as that of a rehabilitated man. However, his statements were interpreted as a confirmation of his lack of remorse. Instead of improving his situation, they increased hostility towards him and solidified the perception that he remained an unrepentant Nazi. Social and media pressure continued to rise. His name appeared in anti-fascist campaigns denouncing the presence of former SS officers in Western Europe. Travis's property became a symbol of that controversy. The local community, initially distant, was caught in a confrontation that exceeded the limits of the small town and connected with European debates on justice, memory, and historical responsibility. In this climate of growing tension, the life of Joachim Piper in France became a precarious exile. Although he had sought anonymity, he ended up being the subject of renewed public attention. The combination of local hostility, media pressure, and anti-fascist activism transformed what had started as a quiet retreat into an increasingly insecure environment. Revenge in flames, the blazing end of a Nazi commander. The interviews given by Joachim Piper to the French press in July of 1976 had an immediate effect on his fate. His statements revealed that he remained identified with the values of the Nazi regime and showed no remorse for the crimes committed during the war. Faced with questions about his responsibility in civilian massacres, he replied that he had fulfilled his duty as a German soldier and had nothing to be ashamed of. His most provocative words were directed against France. He stated that in 1940 the French had demonstrated a lack of courage and that this was the reason why he could reside peacefully in the country. He added that, despite his disdain for the French national character, he appreciated the tranquility of the rural areas and the natural beauty of the territory. The press widely disseminated these statements, interpreted as a deliberate provocation. The anti-fascist groups used the interviews as proof that Piper represented a latent ideological threat. The reaction was immediate. Graffiti multiplied on the walls of his property, makeshift barricades appeared at entrances to traverse, and acts of vandalism were repeated on his mailbox. The threats also came by letter and telephone. The senders warned that their presence would no longer be tolerated and that they must leave France or face consequences. Some missives included photographs of victims of massacres attributed to units under their command, accompanied by messages of revenge. The local police limitedly reinforced surveillance around their home, although they lacked the resources to establish continuous night protection. The French authorities initially interpreted these actions as intimidating rather than as an imminent danger. The Embassy of West Germany in Paris expressed concern and recommended Piper to leave the country temporarily. He rejected the suggestion, arguing that leaving would be equivalent to acknowledging guilt. His wife Sigurd, more aware of the risk, moved to Germany to stay with relatives while the situation remained unstable. During that period, Piper adopted self-protection measures. He arranged a small arsenal in his home, a .38 caliber Colt revolver, a .22 caliber hunting rifle, and a double-barreled shotgun. The weapons were kept loaded and distributed in different rooms. He adjusted his routine, avoiding unnecessary outings and keeping the curtains closed during the day. At night, he conducted armed surveillance rounds around the house. The neighbors perceived him as increasingly isolated and aged. His appearances were rare, and his physical appearance reflected stress and permanent tension. In correspondence with former comrades of the Waffen-SS, he expressed the conviction of being the target of an international conspiracy led by communist and anti-fascist groups. On the 14th of July of 1976, the day of the French national holiday, the tension reached its culmination point. Piper remained at his residence, considering that the patriotic celebrations could intensify the hostility. During the afternoon, he observed signs of intrusion, recent cuts in the wire fence and suspicious movements in the vicinity of the property. In the early morning of the 15th of July, around 1, several individuals approached the house from different directions. The attack began with the throwing of Molotov cocktails against the wooden walls. The flammable fuel clung to the structure and the flames spread quickly. Piper reacted by shooting from the upper floor. He first used the shotgun and then the rifle against positions where he had detected movement, particularly towards an oak tree located a few meters from the house. The attackers kept the distance and responded with more Molotov cocktails that intensified the fire. The flames penetrated the ground floor, fueled by furniture and books from his personal library. He tried to save some documents and belongings by throwing them out the windows, but the spread of the fire forced him to retreat. As the smoke spread, he also used the revolver to shoot towards the outside. Investigators later found shell cases and cartridges in several rooms, confirming that he had resisted until the collapse of the structure. The fire advanced quickly, the roof partially collapsed and the exits were blocked. The accumulation of toxic smoke and combustion gases turned the interior into an uninhabitable space. Piper was trapped in his office, the room where he did his translations and kept his library. The firefighters were alerted by neighbors who saw the glow of the fire. The distance from the nearest station and failures in the pumping equipment delayed their intervention. By the time they managed to control the flames, the house had been reduced to a blackened structure with still smoldering debris. The body was found in the office. The remains were severely charred, reduced by thermal contraction to a fraction of their original size. Identification was made through metallic objects, his wristwatch, stopped at 1 o'clock in the morning, and fragments of a civilian uniform that had partially withstood the fire. Forensic reports concluded that the most likely cause of death was asphyxia due to smoke inhalation before the complete destruction of tissues by the fire. The investigation confirmed the intentional nature of the attack. Remains of Molotov cocktails were found inside and outside the house, as well as cuts in the perimeter wire. The shots fired by Piper had hit nearby trees, with no evidence of having reached the attackers. Days later, a group called the Avengers sent a letter to several media outlets claiming responsibility for the action. The letter described the preparation of the attack and justified it as an act of justice against a war criminal. The identity of its members was never known, nor were there any new actions attributed to this group. The case officially remained unsolved. The death of Piper generated diverse reactions. The anti-fascist groups celebrated it as belated justice and recalled the villages burned on the Eastern Front, the Boves massacre in Italy, and the execution of prisoners in Malmedy. The authorities of West Germany lodged a formal protest with France for not having guaranteed the safety of a German citizen, although these complaints had limited resonance. German public opinion was divided. Some sectors lamented the outcome, while others considered it an inevitable consequence of his past. The ruins of the dwelling attracted curious people in the following days. The land was cleared shortly afterwards to prevent it from becoming a pilgrimage site. The symbolism of the event was evident to contemporary observers. An officer who had ordered villages to be burned during the war perished in an arson in his own exile.